I was very pleased to be invited by the Society to give an address during this year. I imagine, as your President has indicated, that he would expect me to have spoken in this year on a lofty topic of general application on the use and purposes of history and Jubilee celebrations. I've in fact gone completely the other way. Instead of taking a macro view of history and the Jubilee, have in fact taken a micro view and intend to explore in a personal way a subject which, as has already been indicated, is a matter of some considerable controversy. And I certainly don't expect all of you to agree with all of the views that I express, but I'm certainly happy to debate them very vigorously with you, as indeed in other forums and on other occasions I probably have over some time. I would say, incidentally, in commencing my address, that I'm here not just as the Premier of South Australia, the primary reason for my invitation, but also as a member of the Society of some long-standing, financial member, I might add. I pay my dues. The President hasn't made me any honorary offers yet, but I'm certainly happy to pay my dues because I think the monthly bulletins and in particular the journal that's been produced is of great interest and value, and anybody purporting to be active in public life and affairs in this state ought to have some access to the sort of topics and historical dissertations that the Society carries out. I certainly believe it's important, and even if I didn't have a personal interest in history, which indeed I do, I equally would feel some responsibility as Premier of the state of understanding its history, its origins, what makes it tick, because if we don't, then we don't govern very well. So I guess I could say that I would probably prefer to be standing before you as an historian, a writer or researcher into some of these topics. Indeed, at some stage I vaguely toyed with the idea of such a career, but the immediacy of political life and other circumstances have impelled me into the position of, well, in one sense, I suppose, making history, certainly subjecting myself to some kind of assessment by historians, which is a pretty daunting thought at times, although I must admit that there have been such a line of premiers and so many of them have been not terribly distinguished that there may not be very much to fear in that respect. But nonetheless, it is, I guess, it would have been a matter of preference perhaps for me to have been an observer. Perhaps that can wait. At the moment, my fate is to be in a position where at times the decisions that are made in a lot of areas can affect the life and indeed the history of the state for good or ill. I believe, as I've said, that an interest in, an appreciation of history is a vital component to anyone in public life. I think it also helps too when the debate is taking place, and this reflects particularly on my topic, to have a reasonable grasp of history. It enables one, firstly, to have a perspective on the events of the day. Invariably, the media reaction is one of immediacy. Often the impression is that something has happened for the first time and that for the first time we are grappling with particular problems, when indeed that may not be the case. In fact, it may even have only been last week or last year or perhaps 10 years ago that these problems were confronted. It also helps one dispel a lot of the romantic myths that are often peddled around about particular decisions and particular aspects of policy making. A lot of people call history to their aid to support a particular point of view. We all do, and we'd all like to. It's often useful to be able to analyse the facts, and as I say, to dispel some of the romantic myths that can build up around particular issues and get that better perspective of current events and attitudes. Now, in that sense, and in addressing your society in the Jubilee 150 year, I thought, what can I contribute to this concept? What area of policy perhaps could be examined, and in what way? What's special about South Australia that could be chosen? I suppose what stands out is the fact that South Australia didn't happen here by accident. It was a planned settlement. Right from the beginning, ideas formed a part of our development and the reason for our existence. And it's something that I think has continued with us throughout the 150 years of our history and has made us somewhat special. Economic and social planning, the role of public and private sectors together have been an important component of the development of South Australia. In a political perspective, I guess, I would see in the history and development of South Australia a very strong thread of that democratic socialist tradition that does lay great stress on social responsibility and planning. That's got its strengths, certainly, and I think we've demonstrated those strengths in many ways, and the quality of life and the way in which our city and our state is shaped are testimony to that. But I acknowledge it also has its weaknesses. Planning can be inflexible, it can be overly bureaucratic, it can often not respond when it should to genuine economic forces or social influences. It can at times even make you vulnerable. In our bad days and times, I guess a lot of people have pointed the finger at South Australia and said the reason that South Australia has suffered so acutely, for instance, during the Great Depression, is because you are an artificial creation. Your society has developed through an idea based on plans. Well, there is some truth in that, but not a great deal. I think the strengths far outweigh the weaknesses, and that's why so many of us enjoy living and working in South Australia and wouldn't particularly want to be anywhere else, or if we were, we'd hope it'd only be on a temporary basis. I'm certainly not thinking of Canberra when I say that, although that's a planned city too. So if one sees planning as an important part, I thought I would then focus more onto that area of planning, environment, of development, and the debate that surrounds it. But again, instead of making lofty policy pronouncements about that, try and look more particularly at an area in which one can see as an example, draw lessons from it, see how the questions are posed, and see what influence history has had on that particular area. In other words, to illustrate it by a particular micro-example. Well, in this particular instance, I've decided to look at an important area which affects us all who live and work in this city in particular, to express some personal views about it, in fact establish a kind of oral history on the subject, I guess, and try and relate that to some of the decisions and controversies of today. Personal views, in other words, on the development or alienation of our Adelaide parklands. Now, in this I'm not so much intent on exploring their history. That's been very well done in a number of areas, in articles, in reports, in chapters of books, such as Derek Whitelock's book. Most usefully and comprehensively, I would suggest, in Jim Daly's MA thesis of 1980, The Adelaide Parklands, A History of Alienation, which I've had the privilege of reading and, having done so, would certainly hope to see published at some stage. It's a very important basic document and analysis of the parklands and what it means for Adelaide. But as I say, I don't intend to explore except incidentally that history, although drawing on those sources and references as appropriate. I'd rather confine myself to the way in which the parklands has personally impacted on a particular citizen of Adelaide who at the moment, however temporarily, has some position of policy decision-making power, namely myself. And in reflecting on that, I realised that I've spent a very great deal of time in them over a period of some 40 years or so, to this day, and on a daily basis, in some way or other, have contact with the Adelaide parklands. Incidentally, that period of time is nearly a third of their existence, a somewhat sobering thought, and I guess through Jubilee 150 we're constantly reminded of just how short our history is, and how much development, therefore, and how much change lies ahead, how far we've come in such a very short time. But the parklands have played a very significant part in my life, and I guess the true significance of them, and feelings about them was really brought to a head in that very visible and lively controversy around the development called the ACER project. In fact, it was in that context that I did a lot of thinking about the parklands and what they meant to Adelaide and what sort of directions and policies should apply to them. In the course of that controversy, I certainly received a lot of correspondence attacking the way I'd assisted in the desecration and alienation of the parklands. And I know there are still some people who believe on a daily basis, as they look at the splendid buildings rising over the railway station area, that their views have been thoroughly confirmed. Naturally, of course, I don't share those views. I'll come to that in a moment. The stimulus of Light's decision to incorporate parklands in the way he did in this city, and the actual intended use of those parklands has been well explored, although it's not terribly well documented. The fact is that for 150 years we have had a ring of parklands around this city. There is some 2,300 acres with an extraordinary range of institutional and public uses, which are one of the most distinctive and important parts of the Adelaide scene. And they've survived, despite all the beneficial and not so beneficial depredations of them. I'd like to believe, in looking back at that history, that whatever else influenced the colonisation commissioners and the honoured colonel, that the concept of space accessible to the general public, a sort of democratic approach to access, was to the fore in their thinking. Now, Jim Daly, in his thesis that I've just referred to, draws attention to the instruction of the commissioners that to Colonel Light, that you will make the necessary reserves for squares, public walks and quays. And he links that reference to public walks with an 1833 report of a select committee of the House of Commons on public walks, with which, of course, the colonisation commissioners would have been familiar. That committee examined the question of public walks or open spaces fitted to afford means of exercise and amusement to the middle and humbler classes. This was a question of public amenity with a social purpose. Put in the terms of those days, they were reserved for the amusement, under due regulation to preserve order, of the humbler classes. By so doing would assist to wean them from low and debasing pleasures. So there was, of course, an earnest social purpose in providing the middle and humbler classes with this access to recreational space around their city. Those debasing pleasures included drinking, dog fights, boxing matches. If they'd thought of it, it probably might have included casinos as well. But I speak against myself there. Well, I subscribe to the very broad concept of the parklands providing amenities for all, and believe that due regard must be had to the very different needs and expectations of ordinary people in our community. They're not the preserve of the middle class, of the educated, or of any particular interest group. The school of thought that sees every development on the parklands as alienation or destruction and yearns for a belt of natural and presumably untended bushland, and the less extreme variants of them, often ignore the very differing needs for recreation and amenity of ordinary people in our community. In any case, I think it's worth mentioning again that the natural state of the parklands didn't last long. Trees were cut, immigrants' camps and huts erected, stone quarried, horses, cows and sheep were grazed, rubbish was dumped, right from the beginning. In 1840 there were apparently 6 keepers employed in the parklands, but these were convalescent, destitute immigrants, so I'm not sure how effective they were as rangers, or indeed how they'd stack up with our modern park keepers and ranger services. Now, some of and incidentally, when I talk about temporary buildings, dwellings and huts, that's not something that one goes back to the 1840s to find. One need only go back to the 1930s, and there are many people in this city who can remember the parklands areas around the Torrens, near Botanic Park and so on, being put to just that unfortunate use. Today, of course, some of those things continue. The neglect is still there in a number of areas of the parklands. How many of you, for instance, have looked over the top of the mound at the back of the Postal Institute Oval, or running along the side of the road to the airport in the West Parklands? If you do, you'll see the most appalling rubbish dump in a most terrible state. It's quite nicely and attractively hidden, and there's been some good plantings on the mound. I suggest you go up and have a look at that if you believe that the rubbish dumping days of the parklands are over. You don't have to be too old to remember cows grazing in the South Parklands area. As for quarries, well, they've certainly gone, that's true, despite the complaints about the economic cost that that would bring about. Our predecessors obviously didn't want us to forget them. They cut them into the face of the Mount Lofty range so that we'd all be able to have a good view of them at all times, just to remind us that we do have a need for stone of that sort. Well, in giving this personal view of the parklands, I thought it might be an appropriate way to take some easy stroll, or perhaps jog might be more suitable, around them. My conclusion will be that by and large they have been very well tended, well protected, marvellously improved, despite alienation which has occurred, and indeed that the last 15 years or so have seen the greatest improvements in access and enjoyment of parklands for the citizens of this state than they have in the 150 years of their history, notwithstanding the considerable controversy that has surrounded a number of things that have happened in the parklands over that period. And incidentally, I might add, that controversy is welcomed. One thing about people in this city is that they do care about their parklands and what happens to them, and they're not afraid to say what they think. Thank goodness we don't have the apathy that has attended some alienations of the parklands in years gone by. Well, to begin our stroll around the parklands, I've identified a number of what I call improvement areas. And the word improvement will have a different value as I go to some of these areas, I guess, to a number of you. But I might say that, as I mentioned earlier, I've lived nearly all my life within a couple of miles of the parklands of Adelaide. Sometimes in splendid middle-class comfort, other times in almost squalid accommodation. So I've seen a fair variety of it. I've lived east and north. In fact, when I reflected on this, it certainly didn't say much for mobility and an adventure on my part, but it does mean, I guess, that I've had a pretty close association with the area. Sometimes the parklands have just been across the road, sometimes, as they are at present, a brisk 6 or 7 minute jog up the road to reach this marvellous Arcadia. There have been a lot of changes in the time in which I've been able to enjoy the amenity of the parklands, and I'll note those changes on our stroll. If we start in the Botanic Park, a very good starting point, I think, for the parklands of Adelaide. It's a haven, like the gardens themselves, for many people with insufficient recreation space, with particular needs, and its use, I think, demonstrates that any day of the week. In my case, in my family's case, it was a particular haven in those dreadful years just after the war, when accommodation was appalling, and the best thing a mother could do with small children was get them out of the house and go somewhere. In our case, to the Botanic Park and gardens. So I remember them fondly and intimately. But the park of those days was very different from the one we see today. It was a veritable jungle and was well overgrown. There were paths which had been there for many years. It was a place which contained many speakers' rings, scenes of all sorts of activity, religious, political, social, revivals, most of them, in my period, already decaying, some still in use, some able to provide certainly a political and social education, which indeed I was able to take advantage of. I noted when I became, in fact, a Labor Member of Parliament, there was a provision in the rules that all members of Parliament had to subscribe to, which said that their attendance, as required by the party secretary at the Labor Party ring, on Sundays was one of the duties of a member. And seemed a very odd requirement because we didn't have meetings on Sunday and the Labour ring in the parklands didn't exist at this time. The rule, incidentally, has since been removed, which is a pity for history, but a rather practical suggestion that we're actually updating them. The reason I understand for this provision was that there were a lot of backsliders who didn't very much like doing duty in the Botanic Park. The meetings could be fairly rough or onerous, and the party secretary, in despair of directing some of these people, eventually had a rule inserted which meant they lost their pre-selection if they didn't turn up. And there it was. The last big rally I can recall in the parklands of that kind was with Cornwall and Whitlam around about 1961. And certainly they were there in the Labour ring and the Labour ring was packed. I don't remember many after that. The Communist Party, of course, stayed on to the end, and even when I was at school I certainly attended some of their meetings to get a bit of education. I can remember Jim Moss, of course, who has since distinguished himself as a historian with the book he has produced on the history of the Trades and Labour Council recently, Sound of Trumpets. Jim discoursing on the evils of Yankee imperialism, and I certainly cut him around with a withering interjection of "What about Hungary?" I'm not quite sure whether it had much effect on Jim, his audience, or anybody else, but I certainly thought it was a magnificent intervention in the political process. Well, you know, you learn after a while. You know. So those things have gone, and I'd like to call that improvement area number one. Not that I don't regret the passing of the open-air meetings and all that surrounded them, but they are a thing of the past. The improvements that have taken place in and around the Botanic Park certainly warrant being recognised as such. The Gardens Board has always had a sort of love-hate relations with the park. It usually wants to ensure, firstly, that it has total control of the park, and you can see that reflected in its history as bits and pieces have been chewed off for zoos and various other functions. Every now and again it gets an excess of annoyance at the intrusion of motor cars into the Botanic Park and wants to put fences, gates and other enclosures around it. But basically, and I think most importantly, the park is still, as it always has been, open and accessible to anyone. And people certainly take advantage of it. I can remember Noel Lothian's major refurbishment. It looked like the greatest act of vandalism of all time. Big trees and stumps were cut down, there were fires burning there for what seemed like days. In fact, the end result was very good indeed, and the Botanic Park we have today is a consequence of the culling and improvement that took place then. Other improvements have included, of course, closure of the road. It was a through road to the city. Thousands of cars travelled every day right slap bang through the middle of Botanic Park. That's often forgotten today. I can certainly well remember it because for about 5 or 6 years my bedroom was the tower room of Athelney House, which in fact sits in a direct line with the road through the Botanic Park. And there was a very large spoon drain, and every car that approached with their lights on full beam, because there was no lighting in the park, would bounce into the spoon drain and up over onto my window. It took some years of getting used to the sort of strobe lighting effect that occurred there. Well, all that's finished and closed off, and we should remember that has been done. Incidentally, in closing it off, a magnificent bridge, early construction bridge, has been preserved forever and is well worth looking at for those who haven't done so. One thing I would say about what I call this improvement area number one is that the park, there is still a schizophrenia about the park and its future and its development. I believe in fact that it has been neglected over the years. There hasn't been sufficient attention paid, and the board claims that they don't really have the resources to do it, to new plantings. Every now and again there's an excess of plantings. I thought the scheme, which had thousands of acacia eteophyllus planted all along the front of the Botanic Park as some kind of hedge, was a disastrous thing, and I'm glad to see somebody in the board or staff must have decided so as well, because they've pulled out a lot of them and they're just in clumps now. But I think the Botanic Park does need more attention. I don't think the motor car should be banned completely from it, because I think that would exclude a number of people from enjoying it. But nonetheless, there it is. It still exists. It's survived 150 years, and it's in better condition than it's ever been before. I guess improvement area number 2 is the Botanic Gardens itself. It is constantly improving and is one of the most pleasant places in this state. And when you think of all the turmoil that went on, the relocation of lunatic asylums and hospitals and other problems that the Botanic Gardens have had, it's a mighty tribute to them that they have produced such splendid shows, such varied plants so successfully. A few memories of those earlier days, like the original morgue, still stand there, but the gardens are certainly firmly established. They did go through a very zealous phase of native vegetation planting and an attempt to hide some of the Victoriana. I remember the hapless Linnaeus, whose bust stood in front of the class grounds, which a very large bush grew all around him, and he became more and more and more obscured, because clearly this was part of a process that was going to get rid of some of these Victoriana extremities. Fortunately, Linnaeus has been returned to his glory recently and stands unencumbered by bushes in the new class ground at the moment. But the gardens, as I say, are splendid, despite the odd cemented creek and one or two other things you might object to. And they will expand on that site, and so they should. When the government came to move to discuss the moving of the Hackney tram barn, it was clear that one of the beneficiaries had to be the Botanic Gardens of Adelaide. And that brings me, of course, to improvement area number 3, the Hackney tram barn itself. Certainly I remember in my youth the trams rolling in and out of there. I can recall the museum, I guess one might call it, of old buses and horse-drawn vehicles and others that stood up at one end of that particular spot. The buses then came and some demolition occurred of the barn, but nonetheless there it was, a real condemnation, I would suggest, of earlier planning practice and a disastrous alienation of the parklands. But nonetheless, an expensive job to try and return it. It's interesting that the government of the day in 1906 or 7, when the decisions were made, which was administration headed by Tom Price, the first Labor Premier of South Australia. Somebody reminded me of that in the course of the ASA controversy, I might add. It was interesting that the government of the day was very wary of alienating parklands as such. In fact, one wonders how cunning they were, because they firstly proposed a site opposite the East End markets, which clearly was parklands, and the public outcry and reaction to that was the City Council was such that Cabinet hastily said, oh no, definitely not, we must preserve these parklands. We'll go over here to Hackney to the government orchard, which definitely isn't parklands. It's an orchard, it's not part of the Botanic Gardens or that site. Well, strictly speaking, that was true. But the alienation occurred, and the tram depot and subsequently the bus depot remain. I call it an improvement area because you will be well aware that we have made the decision and are in the middle of commencing the process of transferring that tram barn and returning it to the parklands. It's taken a long time. It won't be done overnight, but certainly that is a major step in restoring an important area of parkland enjoyment to the people. But there's the interesting thing about heritage issues. One sees that disaster and thinks of the controversy of establishing it, and a later government makes the decision to move it, and suddenly people stand up and say, but wait a minute, if you're going to move it, you can't knock down those buildings, they're heritage items. Well, that's a difficult conundrum, and it's occurred in one or two other areas as well, and I'll come to that when I discuss the railway station. But there will be at least one building preserved on that site. We don't accept the heritage value, despite the beauty of the brickwork of Tom Price's tram barns, and they will come down. Improvement Area 3, as we move on our stroll, of course, is the ENWS depot. The first depot, established in the 1850s, there were people who lived in and around Hackney and College Park and so on, whose fathers and grandfathers had worked in that depot, and were appalled at the thought that this was going to be removed, and couldn't understand why anyone would suggest that this really was part of the parklands. But parklands it was. I mean, there were quite recent developments on that site. I can always remember the big building that fronted Botanic Road. It had G6R in the coat of arms on it. It was built around about 1939 probably. That's gone. So have all the other buildings. There is some memorial left to the fact that the ENWS operated there, but finally another major area of parklands has been returned, and that's a plus, and it's only happened in the last few years. Improvement area number 4, I guess, is the Rymel Gardens and those areas moving further to the south. I'd put a large question mark over the bowling club. One of the most privileged bowling clubs, I guess, in Australia. When one thinks about it, they were given prime parklands by Kintore Avenue at their establishment, and a 24-hour liquor licence to boot, which they've held on to through thick and thin, war, depression and adversity to this very day. And when at last moved, were moved to another salubrious parkland site. I've never examined the membership list, but I think they might be more rewarding than the Adelaide Club. I say that with due deference to any Adelaide Bowling Club members who may be present. But anyway, the bowling club's there, and so are a number of other things, but it means a lot of people are using that parklands, and again, there's been palpable, clear improvement over the last few years. Now let me venture into the major horns of controversy as I turn to improvement area number 5. This is the Victoria Park Racecourse and the Grand Prix track. A lot of things have been said about that, but I believe that the way in which that particular event has been handled has demonstrated there is a compatibility between an international class and economically important activity taking place in Adelaide, consistent with the preservation and indeed the development of the parklands. The solution for our street circuit for the Grand Prix did involve putting down a piece of permanent bitumen in the car parking areas of the Victoria Park Racecourse. But in consequence of that event, and I'm putting to one side completely the enormous economic, tourist and other benefits that event has already shown for us, the consequence of that has been some considerable improvements to the parklands area which would not have occurred. There has been a great increase in planting. There's been the installation of watering systems, and progressively over time I think we will find that there will be some very positive results, and the price of it is that once a year, a week a year use. The joggers, the walkers, the riders, everybody else who enjoys the amenities, the race goers will continue to do so, but in an enhanced environment because of that development. Improvement area number 6, one moves round into the South Parklands, and this is an area that in fact for about 4 or 5 years when I was living in the city, in Gilles Street, I again daily jogged or walked through, and have seen, even in that period of time, tremendous developments in plantings and in rejuvenation of what was a fairly run-down area. And a road closure too. Can one remember George Joseph saying the commuters will not stand for this, they've got to come in from the eastern suburbs, through the road, past the electricity trust, and this is going to strangle the city. Well, the road's been closed, and I haven't seen the city strangled or disaster caused. But there's been a very definite improvement to the amenity of those living and recreating in that corner of the city. But so I think as the gardens developments along all that strip of the South Parklands, there's a great mixture there. The latest addition is the Japanese garden, the gift of Himeji City, which has been extremely tastefully and well done, is well worth looking at. Earlier, of course, the formal gardens that comprise the Veal Gardens, which are well worth a visit. The council obviously puts a lot of resources and energy into it, and thousands of people take advantage of that. The playing fields, the vistas you can get are all an important part of it. And again, I'd suggest it's an improvement area. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the West Terrace Cemetery. Ambitious plans have been made at various times to do something about that. There are some extremely important sites and buildings, and I think the time must soon come where some resources are put into doing something serious about the cemetery and its future. The work, the preliminary work has been done, the recommendations are there, the resources, the will to do it so far hasn't, or the priority hasn't emerged. The next improvement area I'd suggest is, again, the strip going further north along the western rim of the parklands, where the new airport road is being constructed. Like much of the road construction that has been going on in and around the parklands, it has usually been accompanied with either road closures or rerouting and a net gain to parklands area. Now, in this particular case, I don't know what the statistics or figures are, but certainly the new road will enable a far better and tighter access to turn-offs and railway property, while allowing for a whole new landscaping of that area. The Postal Institute buildings are to be removed. The Commonwealth has agreed to give them up. The high school still stubbornly remains there, and probably will for a very long time to come, unfortunately. That's a fairly recent decision, and certainly a post-war decision to develop it further and consolidate it. I guess we should be grateful that it didn't go into the site near Frome Road, where it was suggested in the 30s, although, I don't know, when one looks at some of the developments that have occurred down that end of the parklands, the Institute of Technology car park and so on, one wonders. The Weather Bureau building has gone, and perhaps people can remember again, that caused considerable controversy and debate. The high school could have made very good use of those buildings and wanted to do so. The Cabinet of the day had to insist on a number of occasions, because there was some bureaucratic resistance to that building having been acquired, being demolished. In fact, I joined the Cabinet by 1978 myself, when the matter was still being discussed, because as long as the building stood, there were always last-minute attempts to say that it had to be used. It was too valuable to knock down. It was cleared on the principle that, where possible, we should try and return the parklands to original purposes, and institutional buildings should be removed. Landscaping, tree planting, a whole lot of things has occurred there, and again that area is transformed from even the playing fields that many of us remember. Improvement area 8, I would say, is the area of the Torrens Bank, Benython Park, and those sections. And again, look at the uses there. There are pools which people with model boats can use. There are walking trails. There are pleasure canoes on the Torrens Lake and in that sector. There's some fairly wild areas. It's really a marvellous section of the Adelaide Parklands, and again, go there any weekend and you will see thousands and thousands of people, sometimes at functions, sometimes at circuses, but more often than not simply as small family groups or groups of friends enjoying the amenities of that area. And it's been greatly improved in recent years. It's not a jungle, it's safe, it's accessible. The 9th improvement area in this vicinity is, of course, the Adelaide Jail Thebarton Police Barracks. As you know, the Adelaide Remand Centre is almost complete, and as the Adelaide Remand Centre and the new Mobilong medium security prison is established, so Adelaide Jail will become available for other than prison uses. Not before time. It is a disgraceful place. It's overcrowded. Some of its facilities, particularly its sewage facilities, are totally substandard. It's an 1840s or 50s prison, and still in its original state. A great museum. The trouble is that living, breathing human beings occupy it. Well, they're going to be moved out, and they're going to be moved out as soon as we possibly can over the next 2 or 3 years. We then have to decide what we're going to do with that site and that building. There are a number of quite imaginative suggestions, and I would hope that members of this society, in whatever capacity, can have some input into that process. It's going to be another splendid heritage area, Unfortunately, resources are going to be fairly constrained in terms of developing it, but I believe it can be valuable. Adjoining it, of course, the Thebarton Police Barracks is a longer-term proposition, but the government in principle is undertaken to move at least some of the non-park lands type functions, and when I refer to them, one of the most valuable aspects of the Thebarton Police Barracks is the stabling and adjustment areas for the police greys. That's probably a compatible use, and there are ways of designing that site, reducing the use of the police, but still providing it for those particular purposes, while at the same time returning more parklands to open access. The little block occupied by the ENWS is also one that we would like to see freed up, but that's a bit further down the track. However, there is an active plan which was initiated, as you recall, by the government commissioning Mr. Tompkinson to undertake a major study and do some planning to see how and when and at what cost we could shift a number of these facilities. So there is another major potential improvement area, the Adelaide Jail and environs, which we'll see some action happening on in the not too distant future. Continuing on around the parklands and moving north, improvement area number 10, I guess, is those golf courses and the road closures and reconstructions that have been taking place in that northwest corner of the parklands. The golf courses are a great amenity. They are open to the public, they are well used by golfers and in a recreation rather than a competitive sense, but they're also accessible to the general public for walking, jogging or whatever, providing you look at who's driving off at an appropriate moment. It's a very good way of ensuring that a large tract of parkland can be kept in pristine condition, well treed, grassed, watered, at no major cost, because the golf courses fund themselves through the green fees that are collected. And those courses are certainly of a standard that any club, any private club would be proud of, particularly since the greening of the North Course. You'll recall that was not so long ago, just a dry, fairly barren tract, but it's been greened of recent years. The water is on it, and it's certainly made a tremendous difference to that area of the parklands. And a number of the through road closures that took place, which have rationalised the traffic, have also meant a net gain of parkland in that area. Improvement area number 11, we now turn to the north parklands and the famous or infamous swimming pool. Now let me say about that, firstly, when the city baths were closed and demolished, there was clearly a need for another public swimming pool facility. It was a cheap expedient to use parklands on which to locate it. There should have been an effort made to raise the finance and identify a site which would not have taken that easy option. Now, sure, that's been the history of the parklands. The tram barn and a number of other things represent those easy options. It's a pity that as late as, 1971 or so, they were still being taken. But the swimming pool was there, a fact of life. A very considerable sum of public money had been put into developing it on that site. It had lights, if you'll recall. It was open air. It was very intrusive visually. It was unusable for half of the year or more. And in all respects, something had to be done about it. What has been done about it, I think, is the best possible solution to that problem. And just as the buildings of the tram barn have become examples of early 20th century heritage in Adelaide, despite the outrage of their original placement, so I think you'll find the swimming pool, which is of an interesting, innovative design, will become too a symbol of something unique and at the same time provide a very important amenity to this state and city. The view of it as you fly over, in fact, in the evening is quite remarkable. It's like a great lighted pyramid, a thing from outer space. From the ground, particularly as the trees and vegetation develop around it, it will not be, and isn't really at the moment, visually intrusive. It will merge into the general area of the parklands. I think, as I say, a very good solution has been found to a very difficult problem. The expediency of the early 70s has been replaced by a fairly expensive but nonetheless effective long-term improvement, which has raised the amenity of that area of parkland. As we then travel back again towards the east, the horse track, old cross-country course, the olive grove on Park Terrace and the road closures that have taken place there in lower North Adelaide have again made very significant differences in recent years. Again accompanied by controversy across the other side of the road. I think all of us regretted the demolition of Porter's House, which we were told was absolutely essential to the roadworks and construction that was going to take place. But then when you look at what actually happened to that area, you wonder quite why it was so essential. Nonetheless, that occurred. But meanwhile, the changes that have been made have resulted in, again, a net increase in parkland area in that section of parklands with the road closures of Stanley Street and so on. A far greater improved traffic flow. As a jogger who has to run across that area frequently, the road is a lot more easy to traverse than it used to be. And olive trees have been replanted in profusion so that we will see the olive grove effect in the not too distant future, which will improve and restore the amenity. A good mix of modern road traffic management through the parklands, always a major problem for parklands, with a return to a historical environment of the olive groves themselves. Then we come to the next improvement area. I think we're up to 13 or 14 at this stage, which is the Torrens Bank itself. As somebody who has walked and jogged around this area for perhaps 30 years, the total change that's taken place has been very much for the better. I remember being somewhat alarmed at the thought that the area to the east of the Albert Bridge would become the landscaped formal gardens that the council seemed to be developing. In fact, that hasn't occurred. The way in which the tracks have been put through, and this work is only very recent, just in the last 12 months, the plantings that have been made will ensure that it retains that real bushland aspect, but more importantly will also again give access to people in areas you just couldn't go into. That great thicket of reeds or something in which snakes lurked and nobody could walk through has gone to be replaced by environmentally compatible but nonetheless accessible areas at the back of the zoo and around. I guess that's an example too of what a public project can do in terms of upgrading. The 14th improvement area is the zoo, upgraded progressively over the years. It's a true zoological gardens, and I think that there has been enormous improvements in the display of animals, the sensitivity of plantings, and the environmental improvements that have been made. And the response of the public to that particular area is obviously testimony to that. Meanwhile, across the road, the old Koala Farm's gone, and there's a bit more parkland made accessible to people. Improvement area 15. We come to the cultural boulevard and our institutions. The museum redevelopment, of course, is the classic and most dramatic example of modern public expenditure to upgrade, preserve, and put to new uses some of our most historic buildings. It's one of the most exciting projects of its type in Australia. It's progressing well, and as each stage is unveiled, I think public acceptance will quickly demonstrate that money has been spent wisely. I don't wish to say much about the university, hospital and institute areas because I think this has been one of the big failures on the whole parklands. Those institutions were vigorous lobbyists, skilled in getting their way and getting access to land. Some of their designing work and building development, the Teachers College building, the Playford building and the Institute have been, I think, environmentally quite unacceptable. Others have not fitted their environment despite the intrinsic value that they have. That whole area, I think, is one that you can have regret about the gradual encroachments that have been made and the cost cutting and low-class design that's often accompanied that alienation. But let's not forget the amenity of it. We have a central city university, teaching hospital of a kind that any city in the world would be proud. It's confined onto a small area, but it's nonetheless very accessible and produces high quality results. Moving to improvement area 16, and we're nearly reaching the end of our stroll, is of course the festival centre and environs there. Major controversy over the siting of the festival centre. I don't think you'd find many people now, following the demolition of the city baths and the old government printer's office and the changes made to Elder Park, all in consequence of that, who would argue that the festival centre has not been a marvellous success and is well sited. There are still some criticisms, and perhaps valid ones, about the accessibility of that area, accessible particularly if one looks at the plaza development. I don't think the plaza has ever worked, and indeed far from, not only has it not worked, but at the moment it's deteriorating in an unacceptable way, and very considerable sums of public money are having to be spent in upgrading and restructuring it. The net effect, though, I think will be a great improvement, because we are taking the advantage of the structural changes that have to be made to the Festival Plaza to redesign it, to make it more warm and accessible and inviting to people. Some of the effect of that could be seen at the last Festival of Arts. We hope to reproduce some elements of that in the final design and planning of the plaza redevelopment of the Festival Centre. But the centre itself still stands as a very successful piece of architecture, very functional, and a very good symbol of the city. Improvement areas around the Constitutional Museum are also, I think, well worthy of note. There's a good example of a new use for an old building, imaginative. It's all happened in the last 10 years. We take these things for granted after they've occurred, but even in my short time as a Member of Parliament, I remember sitting in an office down in the basement of Parliament House, looking at apprentices sitting back, bored with their studies in the decaying constitutional, the old assembly building, tap dancing lessons taking place on the floor upstairs. All those things have gone, it's been improved, it's refurbished. Well, let me come finally to the last improvement area I wish to refer to. This is, of course, the railway station and the Adelaide Station redevelopment project. I don't want to speak about it at length because it's of very recent vintage, and the debates and arguments pro and con are still all fairly fresh in our mind. It's probably a matter of great regret that Colonel Light didn't provide for railways in his plan, or think about what sort of depredations they would wreak on the city. But the fact is that though railways existed at the time he was planning the city, their real impact and the fact that they were going to develop to the extent they did was not apparent. Incidentally, in looking at that terminal building of the railway station where the lines terminate, as far back as 1850, when plans were being discussed for the railways, it was said that the best place was to commence the line in the stone quarry. The area, in other words, at that time was not an area of high amenity or parkland. It was an ugly stone quarry, unfilled and in a pretty poor condition. A great place to put a railway line, one could say, and that's exactly what was done. We've had a couple of railway buildings on that site, and the latest one, and it is of fairly late vintage, 1930, is another interesting example of what I call the tram barn effect. One of the big criticisms levelled at the ACER development was that we were putting these new buildings, this hotel and convention centre, next to a heritage building. The other argument was that we were doing this particular project on the park lands. Now, I suggest that there's some inconsistency in that sort of argument, because both of those arguments were used by the same people. Firstly, the railways are a fact of life, and so long as we have a suburban rail system, and when one looks at the cost of running it, I'm not sure that will be as long as some people think, we're going to need a railway station where it's placed. And there's not very much you can do with railway yards. Sure, a lot of prime land has been alienated for those railway yards, workshops and whatever, and that's a source of great regret.